All right, for the very latest on this, we're now being joined by Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics, Clinton Institute, University College Dublin. He joins us from the UK. And Scott Lucas, thanks very much indeed for talking to us this afternoon. Now, Russia has certainly intensified its attacks in 15 out of 24 regions of Ukraine. Is this the kind of retaliation that the West had imagined to the Kursk invasion by Ukraine? Moscow is hitting back hard.
I think it was anticipated that this type of mass attack would be in large part a Russian response to the Ukrainian now 3-week incursion, which has taken part of the Kursk region in Western Russia. I mean, after all, this is the first time that either the Soviet Union or Russia have been invaded since 1941 and World War II. It is a great embarrassment for the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin. Remember, they had said at the start of their invasion, their own invasion in February 2022, we can take Kyiv within 3 days. Well, they haven't taken Kyiv within 3 days. They haven't taken it within 2.5 years. And instead, it's Ukraine which is seizing Russian territory. And the Russians are unable at this point to get Ukraine out. They haven't been able to counterattack effectively. So what do? You go back to this superiority that the Russians have with the missiles, with the Iran-made drones, and you punish Ukraine's civilians. You punish them either by killing them outright, or you punish them by trying to destroy the energy infrastructure, hoping that you can freeze them when winter comes, hoping that now you can cause power blackouts and indeed also disrupt water supplies. I think the question here is, this assault that we saw yesterday is the largest Russian assault of the invasion, 127 missiles alone. Do the Russians have sufficient supplies of missiles that they can keep doing this? Or is this effectively maybe the last huge response by the Russians to try to push back Ukraine in its counteroffensive, which is not only in Kursk, but also in the political arena, with Ukraine saying, look, we're not going to give in to Russian demands because we can hold our own and resist, even if the U.S. is tying our hands behind our back.
Mm-hmm. So effectively, I want to ask you, has the war changed since the Kursk invasion by Ukraine? As you pointed out yourself, it was a huge embarrassment for Moscow. Civilian infrastructure is being attacked, and Putin seems to be deliberate in his move to hit power infrastructure ahead of the winter season, as you said.
Well, I want to emphasize that the Russians have hit civilian sites and have hit energy infrastructure throughout 30 months. They've carried out mass killings of civilians, and they have no impunity against doing so. But where we are now and why these strikes are occurring, think back to a month ago. So a month ago, with Russia gradually taking territory in eastern Ukraine, and they still are making a gradual, if limited, advance, the whole narrative that the Kremlin was putting out is we need, quote, peace talks. And what they meant by peace talks is that Ukraine would have to give up not just Crimea, which was occupied in 2014. They would have to give up 4 of their regions, 2 in the east, 2 in the south. And the international community would have to accept that. And the Russian narrative was, if you don't agree to our peace talks, we're just going to keep hitting Ukraine from the air and on the ground. Once Ukraine went into Kursk, it completely changed the narrative. Now the narrative was not that Russia would just keep attacking, but now Russia's having to defend itself. So it's not about peace talks by Russia now. Ukraine can now go to the international community and say, support us so we can get negotiations that begin with a Russian withdrawal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this war is, nowhere from ending from what we see. Both sides are digging in their heels. Zelensky has again said that the attacks highlight the need for long-range capabilities, once again asking its Western allies for those missiles that the U.S. is holding back on for so many months. What do you think will happen now?
Well, at this point, I think it's more of the same, even as this Russian threat on the ground and in the air is quite evident. I think the Biden administration, although it began supplying the long-range U.S. missiles back in April, after hesitating for months, when they supplied those missiles, they told Ukraine, you can use them against Crimea. You can use them against occupied territory. You cannot use them inside Russia. And the U.S. continues to say that. In fact, equally important, the US is effectively vetoing Ukraine using British or French long-range missiles, which they do have and which could be used immediately against, and let's be clear what they're being used for, against the Russian launch sites, against Russian air bases and other sites which are firing these missiles and firing these drones. I can talk to you about why the Americans are doing this. I think the primary reason is they fear it would be an escalation of the conflict with Russia, but I don't buy that. I mean, Russia's already escalated this conflict, and I do find it puzzling why the US is effectively denying Ukraine what is a right to self-defense by being able to counterattack with these missiles further inside Russia.
Okay, so you think that the Americans could do a lot more in this war, despite the fact that many believe it could be an escalation that there's no going back from. What do you think will be the narrative if both sides were to agree to some sort of peace dialogue going forward, given that there's been now 3 weeks of major escalation on the ground?
We're not going to get a peace dialogue. And I'm going to be very clear about this because I know that Prime Minister Modi was in Moscow, he was in Kyiv last week trying to talk about this dialogue. We're not going to get this dialogue for two reasons. The first and foremost reason is Russia doesn't want peace. That's not the purpose of its invasion. Its invasion was to break the Ukrainian government. Its invasion was to put in its own person in charge of Kyiv. Its purpose has been to take as much Ukrainian territory as possible, so they will not negotiate unless they can seize that 20 to 25% of Ukraine that they currently occupy. Secondly, Ukraine is not going to negotiate and pursue peace talks, even though it has a 10-point peace formula, even though it has a global peace summit, which was in Switzerland in June. It will not pursue negotiations unless the Russians agree at the start of talks, not at the end, at the start of talks, that they're going to withdraw military forces.
Okay. Scott Lucas, appreciate you talking to us this afternoon once again on this war that is escalating, and of course with the second night of aerial bombardments by Russia that has launched waves of missiles. Thanks very much indeed for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.